She looked him dead in the eyes, a man who had bled for his country, who had carried wounded brothers off burning hillsides, who had come home with a shattered knee and a service dog instead of a medal ceremony. And she said, "You can't even provide for yourself. What makes you think you can provide for me?" Then she walked out, took her luggage, took her dignity, left behind the man everyone had already written off. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the dog she called a financial burden was about to inherit over $300 million, and she was about to watch it happen on live television. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't scroll past. Because the story you're about to hear is the kind that makes you put your phone down and stare at the ceiling afterward. Every week we bring you stories like this, stories of people who were left for nothing and rose to something no one could have predicted. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now buckle in. The rain came in sideways that night. Not the soft, cinematic kind of rain that Hollywood puts in breakup scenes. This was Harbor Point rain, mean and horizontal, the kind that got inside your collar no matter how you hunched your shoulders. It hammered the fire escapes and turned the gutters into rivers, and made the whole neighborhood smell like wet concrete and cigarette ash. Lucas Mercer stood at the window of the apartment he could barely afford, watching the street below without really seeing it. His left knee ached the way it always did when the weather changed, a deep, grinding throb that started in the joint and climbed up into his hip like a slow electrical current. 3 surgeries, 2 years of physical therapy. And still on nights like this, the thing reminded him it owned him. He'd gotten used to it. You got used to most things, eventually. Behind him, Ranger lifted his head from the floor and watched. The dog was 11 years old, ancient for a German shepherd, especially one who'd worked the jobs Ranger had worked. His muzzle had gone gray in the last 2 years. His hips were stiff in the mornings, but his eyes were still sharp, still alert, still carrying that particular intelligence that made people uncomfortable when they looked at it too long. Like he understood more than dogs were supposed to. Right now, those eyes were tracking Vanessa. She moved through the apartment with surgical efficiency, pulling clothes from the closet and dropping them into a suitcase with the focused energy of someone who had made up their mind a long time ago and was only now allowing the rest of her body to catch up. Her movements were sharp, practiced. She wasn't crying. Lucas had noticed that. He turned from the window. "You've been planning this," he said. Not an accusation. More like confirming something he'd suspected for a while but hadn't wanted to name out loud. Vanessa didn't look up from the suitcase. "Lucas, how long?" She exhaled through her nose, a controlled sound, the kind of sound people made when they were trying very hard not to say what they actually wanted to say. "That's not what matters right now." "It kind of is." She stopped folding, straightened, finally looked at him. And there it was, the thing he'd been dreading, not anger, not guilt, something colder than both, pity. "You're not the same person I got engaged to," she said. "I got injured, Vanessa. I didn't get a personality transplant." "That's not—" She stopped. Started again. "You came back different, and I've tried. I really have, but this—" She gestured at the apartment, at the water stain above the kitchen, at the physical therapy printouts on the refrigerator, at Ranger. "This isn't what I signed up for. You signed up for me. I signed up for you, the version of you who had a future." The words landed the way she'd intended them to, clean and precise, directly over the sternum. Lucas didn't move. He'd taken worse. He'd been trained to take worse. But there was a particular kind of damage that no training in the world could prepare you for, and it came wrapped in a voice you'd trusted. He looked at her for a long moment. "I have a future," he said quietly. "On what?" She laughed, short, humorless. "A via disability check? Lucas, your pension wouldn't cover the car payments on the life I want." She snapped the suitcase shut. "I'm sorry, but I have to be honest with you. That's the most respect I can show you right now." Ranger stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Not aggressive, not posturing. He simply stood up and positioned himself between Lucas and Vanessa with the calm certainty of a dog who had made a decision. His ears were forward, his eyes were on her. Vanessa took a half step back without thinking about it. That dog, she started. His name is Ranger. Is a liability. The vet bills alone are not your problem anymore. Lucas reached down and put one hand on Ranger's back. Sounds like you've made that pretty clear. Something moved across her face then. A flicker of something that might have been regret, or might have been the performance of it. He'd never been entirely sure he could tell the difference with her, and that troubled him more than the rest of it. She picked up the suitcase, picked up her coat, walked toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. I hope you figure it out, Lucas. I genuinely do. Don't, he said. She left. The door didn't slam. That was the thing. She closed it quietly, with controlled precision, as if even in leaving she needed to demonstrate that she was the composed one, the capable one, the one who had things handled. The latch clicked into place. Lucas stood in the middle of the apartment for a moment, absolutely still, the kind of stillness that trained operators develop when the situation is still live and you're waiting to find out what's next. Then his knee gave its familiar complaint, and he let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest for longer than just tonight. He looked down at Ranger. Ranger looked up at him. Just us then, Lucas said. The dog sat down and pressed against his leg. You have to understand who Lucas Mercer was before you can understand what losing everything meant to him. He'd entered Army Special Forces at 22, not because he was looking for glory or had watched too many movies about it, but because someone at his recruiting station had taken one look at his aptitude scores and said, "Have you considered SFAS?" And something in Lucas had gone very still and very certain at the same time. The way it does when the right door opens in front of you before you even knew you were looking for one. He spent the next decade doing work that didn't have official names in press releases. 12-man teams in places that didn't officially have American boots on the ground. Raids at 0-200 in urban compounds. Intelligence handoffs in vehicles moving at 60 miles per hour. The particular exhausted vigilance of men who had stopped counting the deployments and started counting the days. He was good at it. Not flashy. He was never the guy who needed the room to know he was the most dangerous person in it. But his teammates knew. The kind of quiet competence that you only recognized up close when things went sideways and you looked over and there was Lucas, already solving the problem while everyone else was still identifying it. Ranger had come into his life on the third deployment. The dog had been assigned to a different handler, a sergeant named Calloway, who'd taken shrapnel in a vehicle rollover and was medevaced out before they could replace him. The team had needed someone to manage Ranger for the remaining 6 weeks, and Lucas had volunteered because no one else had, and because the dog had looked at him from across the motor pool with an expression that Lucas could only describe as expectant. Their first patrol together, Ranger had stopped 30 meters short of a doorway and refused to move. Just sat down, ears pinned, and looked at Lucas with absolute certainty. Lucas had trusted it. Called the halt. They'd cleared the building with a different entry point. The IED under that threshold had been command detonated. If they'd gone through the door, they would have lost 3 men. After that, Lucas stopped thinking of Ranger as an assigned asset and started thinking of him as a partner. The Army, in its rare moments of institutional wisdom, had noticed and made it permanent. The night of the injury, the night that eventually led to the apartment and the water stain in Vanessa's suitcase, had been a CQB clearance operation in a dense residential area. 3 buildings, multiple threats, approximately 40 minutes of the most concentrated violence Lucas had ever experienced in a decade of experiencing violence. The last thing he remembered clearly was breaching the 3rd building and a structural collapse that the engineers had not accounted for. A ceiling beam the size of a telephone pole, moving at speed. He woke up in Germany. His knee was reconstructed. His left leg was in a fixator. Ranger was lying on the floor beside his hospital bed in a posture that defied every military working dog protocol in existence. And when Lucas opened his eyes and said, "Hey," the dog had made a sound that the nurses claimed they had never heard a military animal make before. He'd been medically retired 9 months later. 2 years after that, he was standing in a Harbor Point apartment listening to a door close. Lucas didn't sleep. He lay on the narrow bed in the apartment's single bedroom. Vanessa had taken the good sheets, which was fine, they'd been hers, and stared at the ceiling while Ranger breathed steadily on the floor beside him. Around 4 a.m., he gave up the pretense and swung his legs over the side and sat there in the dark with his hands hanging between his knees. His phone had 3 texts from his buddy Ray Costas, who'd apparently seen something on Vanessa's Instagram already. "Bro, seriously? Call me when you're up." He didn't call. Not yet. Ray would want to do something. Find the new guy. Make something uncomfortable happen. The kind of response that made sense when you'd spent a decade in environments where problems were solved by direct action. Lucas didn't want that. He just wanted to sit with it for a while and let the shape of it settle into something he could carry. He made coffee. Bad coffee, the off-brand kind from the grocery store, because the good stuff was $16 a bag, and he'd been nursing the same container for 3 weeks. He sat at the kitchen table and drank it, and looked at the folder of unpaid bills, and then deliberately moved his eyes somewhere else. Ranger jumped up onto the chair across from him. He wasn't supposed to do that. Lucas had never once enforced the rule. "We'll be okay," Lucas said. Ranger put his chin on the table and watched him. "I know you know that. I'm telling myself." The thing about bottom moments, real ones, not the theatrical kind, was that they were quieter than people expected. No dramatic music, no rain-soaked catharsis, just a man and a dog in a kitchen at 4 in the morning, drinking bad coffee and doing the math on what the next chapter looked like. The math wasn't great. His disability pay covered the rent and not much else. The PT bills were on a payment plan that stretched to the edge of his vision. He had skills. An extraordinary set of them, actually. But most of them were not easily transferable to civilian resume formats. Proficient in close-quarters building clearance didn't play great in interviews. He'd been doing some security consulting work through a veteran-owned firm called Bridgepoint, but it was irregular and the money came in chunks and gaps. He'd been looking at instructor positions. Tactical training facilities were always interested in guys with his background, but most of them were in Texas or Arizona, and moving felt like one more defeat. He opened his laptop, pulled up the job listings he'd saved, stared at them. He closed the laptop. "One day at a time," he said, to the dog or to himself, or to neither of them in particular. "That's how we did it over there. One objective at a time." Ranger thumped his tail once on the chair cushion. Lucas had moved. Not far. The new place was 12 blocks west, in a neighborhood the real estate listings called transitional, which was what they said when they meant struggling. A studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had 1 elevator, and it was usually broken. The kind of place where the walls were thin enough that you could follow your neighbor's arguments start to finish like a podcast. It was $300 cheaper a month. He'd needed the $300. He'd also needed to not be in the place where Vanessa's absence was a physical presence in every room. The studio was small enough that there was no way to feel her ghost in it. There wasn't room for ghosts. There was barely room for Ranger. They settled into a routine the way soldiers settled into any new operational environment, by establishing the rhythms that kept you functional. Lucas was up at 5:30. Half hour of PT, modified for the knee, which he hated, but did anyway because the alternative was watching his body give up the rest of the way. Ranger got fed first, always, without exception. Good food, not the cheap stuff, because the dog had worked harder than most humans Lucas had ever met and deserved better than grocery store kibble. Then coffee and the job boards and whatever contract work had come in overnight. The PT sessions for his knee were Tuesday to Thursday at a clinic 2 miles away, which he walked to when the weather allowed. His therapist was a woman named Clara Rodden, who had the particular combination of empathy and bluntness that good physical therapists needed. She didn't pretend the progress was faster than it was, but she also didn't let him pretend it was slower. "Your range of motion is actually improving," she told him one afternoon, pressing carefully around the joint. "You've been doing the exercises. Every day. Even the lateral band work. Most people skip that one. I skip the ones I don't need. I don't skip the ones I do." She made a note in her chart. "That's a very military answer." Probably. What he didn't tell her, what he didn't tell anyone, was that some mornings the only reason he got out of bed and did the exercises was because Ranger was sitting beside the bed looking at him with that expectant patience, and walking out on the dog's routine felt like a form of letting someone down. The dog had saved his life in ways both literal and metaphorical, and the least Lucas could do was keep himself functional enough to be worth saving. He'd stopped looking at Vanessa's social media after the first week. He'd made it a decision. the same way he'd made decisions in the field. Deliberately, with reasoning behind it, not a reaction but a choice. Looking at it didn't give him information he could use. It just fueled something that had no useful outlet. So he'd unfollowed, archived, moved on. Ray told him anyway because Ray was a good friend who had a bad habit of thinking that information was always better than ignorance. "She's in Cabo," Ray said over the phone on a Thursday evening. "Some guy's yacht. Guy's name is Preston something. Got a LinkedIn full of words like disruptive and leveraging synergies." "Good for her," Lucas said. I'm not anything, Ray. I'm eating dinner." "What are you eating?" "Rice and beans." A pause. "Bro, it's fine. Rice and beans is good food. Billions of people eat rice and beans." "Yeah, but those people aren't living in Harbor Point eating rice and beans. I know. I'm one of them now." Lucas looked down at Ranger, who was working through a dental chew with the focused dedication of a professional. "I've been in worse spots. At least nobody's shooting at me." Ray didn't laugh. Lucas hadn't really expected him to. "I just want you to be okay," Ray said. "I will be. I'm just not there yet." The phone rang while Lucas was doing paperwork for a Bridgepoint contract, a security assessment for a commercial building that he'd been putting off because the form was 16 pages and had clearly been designed by someone who had never actually done a security assessment. He didn't recognize the number. The prefix was local, but not a number he knew. He almost didn't pick up. He picked up. "Mr. Mercer?" The voice on the other end was male, professional, the kind of carefully calibrated neutrality that lawyers cultivated. "My name is Theodore Wren. I'm a senior partner at Wren and Ashby Law Firm in Ravenshore City. I apologize for calling without advance notice." "What's this about?" "It concerns the estate of Edmund Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker passed away 11 days ago, and you've been named in connection with the probate proceedings. I'd like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience." "I don't know an Edmund Whitaker." A pause. "He knew you, Mr. Mercer. Quite well, it seems, from his perspective at least." Another pause, more deliberate. "I think it would be worth your time to come in. There are matters of considerable significance." "How considerable?" The silence that followed was the kind that carried weight. "The kind that requires an in-person conversation," Theodore Wren said carefully. "Would Thursday work?" Lucas looked at the 16-page security assessment form, looked at Ranger, who had raised his head and was watching him with ears tilted forward. "Thursday works," he said. He put the phone down. Edmund Whitaker. He rolled the name around in his mind and came up empty. He didn't know anyone in Ravenshore City, didn't know any elderly businessmen, didn't know anyone with an estate significant enough to require a senior partner at what sounded like a serious law firm to make personal calls. He picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the Seaview District street below. At the corner store and the cracked sidewalk and the kid on the bike who always went the wrong way through the intersection. Ranger made a soft sound, but not a bark, not a whine. Something in between. "Yeah," Lucas said quietly. "I don't know either." Outside, a Blacktown car rolled slowly past the building. The driver glanced up at the window. Then it was gone. He slept badly that night. Not because of the phone call exactly. It was more that the call had disturbed something that had been sitting still, and now it was moving again. And moving things at 2 a.m. in a studio apartment with thin walls had a way of sounding louder than they were. He lay on his back and watched the ceiling and ran the name again. Edmund Whitaker, Ravenshore City, estate, probate. Nothing. He'd tried a search on his phone after hanging up. There was an Edmund Whitaker who had been a real estate developer in Ravenshore. The search results were sparse, mostly business registrations and a few old local news mentions about commercial projects. The kind of man who built things quietly and didn't need the spotlight for it. The obituary had run in the Ravenshore City Courier 4 days ago. It was short for a man who appeared to have accumulated considerable assets, 79 years old, no surviving spouse, a nephew named Marcus, various philanthropic affiliations, private funeral, by request. There was no mention of Lucas Mercer anywhere. He put the phone face down on the nightstand and closed his eyes and made himself breathe the way he'd learned to breathe in the field. Measured, deliberate, The kind of rhythm that didn't stop the mind from working but kept the body from treating urgency as an emergency. Ranger shifted at the foot of the bed. The neighbor through the wall had an argument with someone on the phone that peaked around midnight and then faded. Thursday was 2 days away. He'd wait. The Wren and Ashby offices were on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Ravenshore that Lucas had driven past twice trying to find parking. He'd borrowed Ray's truck for the trip. His own car had developed a fuel line problem he hadn't gotten around to fixing. And he'd left Ranger in the back seat with the windows cracked and a bowl of water and stern instructions that were entirely unnecessary, because Ranger had always been better at waiting patiently than most humans Lucas had encountered. The lobby of the building was the kind that made you aware of your own shoes. Lucas was wearing clean boots and dark jeans and a button-down he'd ironed that morning, and he still felt like something that had wandered in from a different zip code. He checked in at the front desk and rode the elevator up and sat in a reception area on a chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent. A woman brought him water without asking if he wanted any. He was looking at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling window when Theodore Wren came out to meet him. The lawyer was late 60s, lean, with white hair kept short and a suit that didn't have a single unnecessary feature. He had the handshake of a man who had been shaking hands in serious rooms for 40 years, firm, direct, released promptly. He looked at Lucas with the careful attention of someone who had been told something about this man and was now comparing the information to the reality. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming." He gestured toward the hallway. "I have a conference room reserved." The conference room was large and quiet, with a long table that could have seated 16 and was currently set for 2. There were documents already laid out, a thick manila folder, several bound copies of what looked like formal legal filings, and a single sealed envelope with Lucas's name written on it in handwriting that slanted noticeably to the left. Wren waited until they were both seated. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, opening the folder. Mr. Whitaker's instructions were very specific about the order in which things were to be presented, and I intend to honor them. But before we get into the formal language, he asked me to say something to you in plain terms. Lucas waited. "He said to tell you that you wouldn't remember him, and that was fine. He said the point was never that you'd remember. The point was that he did." Something moved at the back of Lucas's mind. Faint. Not a memory exactly, more like the outline of one. "When was this?" Lucas asked. Wren checked a date in the folder. He drafted this letter approximately 14 months ago, but the episode he's referring to occurred roughly 4 years before that. Summer. He was traveling on Highway 9 just outside Kellner Creek when his vehicle was forced off the road. And there it was. Lucas didn't say anything for a moment. He sat with it. Highway 9. Summer. 4 or 5 years ago. The timeline matched the period between his second and third deployment, when he'd been stateside for 8 months and driving back from visiting his mother in Mill Haven. He'd taken the scenic route because he had time and because the alternative was 4 hours of interstate, and somewhere around Kellner Creek, he'd come over a rise and seen a dark Mercedes on the shoulder with 2 men standing outside it and a third man, older, gray-haired, backed against the car door with his hands up. It had not been ambiguous. Lucas had pulled over. He hadn't thought about it much afterward. The 2 men had run when they'd seen him get out of the truck. He'd had his jacket on and his build was what it was, and he'd spent enough time projecting a particular energy that it had been useful in that moment. The older man had been shaken, but unhurt. He'd refused to call the police. He'd pressed a business card into Lucas's hand and said something about wanting to express his gratitude properly, and Lucas had said it wasn't necessary, and gotten back in his truck and driven away and genuinely not thought about it again until this moment. He hadn't kept the card. "I remember the incident," Lucas said. "I didn't get his name. I didn't stay long enough." Wren nodded slowly. That was consistent with what Mr. Whitaker described. He slid the sealed envelope across the table. "He wanted you to read this before we discuss the estate. Take whatever time you need." Lucas looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he picked it up and opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on heavy cream paper in that same leftward slanting script. It was not a formal document. It read like a man talking to someone he respected but hadn't met properly, which Lucas supposed was exactly what it was. Edmund Whitaker wrote the way certain older men did when they'd spent their lives in boardrooms, and had finally stopped caring about impressing anyone. Directly, with some wry humor underneath the seriousness, and with a clarity about mortality that people only developed when it was genuinely close. He wrote about that day on Highway 9, about what he'd seen when Lucas got out of the truck, about the two men running, about sitting on the shoulder of the road afterward and feeling, for the first time in years, something he described simply as embarrassingly grateful. He wrote about trying to find Lucas afterward and failing because Lucas had driven away before Whitaker had gotten a name, and the private investigator he'd hired had worked from a partial plate number that had taken 11 months to resolve. By the time they'd found Lucas, he was overseas again, and Whitaker had decided that chasing a man across a deployment was not the right way to express gratitude. He wrote about watching from a distance for the next several years, not intrusively. He was careful to say that, but aware. He'd followed the public record, the medical retirement, the move to Harbor Point, the Bridgepoint contracts. He'd become increasingly certain, he wrote, that the universe had handed him a moral debt that he was going to resolve one way or another. He wrote about his family, about Marcus, about the others. His language there was precise and measured and colder than the rest of the letter. The language of a man who had watched people he was supposed to love reveal themselves clearly and had stopped pretending otherwise. Then the final page. You didn't take a card, you didn't stay for thanks, you didn't look back. I've spent a long time in business, and I can tell you that there is one quality more rare than talent, more rare than intelligence, more rare even than courage. And that is a person who does the right thing simply because it's the right thing, without calculating what they'll get for it. Your dog, from what you described, acted on the same principle. I've always found that animals are better at this than people. I intend to reward that quality in the most direct way I know how. I hope you'll accept it in the spirit it's intended. Not charity, but recognition. The difference matters to me. I believe it will matter to you as well. Lucas set the letter down. He looked at the window, the skyline, the buildings going about their business below. How bad was it? He asked. The estate. I'm sorry? How much debt? How complicated? Wren blinked. Then he understood the question and something shifted in his expression. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Mr. Mercer, there's no debt. Mr. Whitaker's estate is entirely solvent, considerably so. Lucas looked at him. The gross valuation, including real property, company holdings, and liquid assets, Wren said carefully, is in the range of $320 million. The room was very quiet. Okay, Lucas said. Wren opened the bound document on his side of the table. Mr. Whitaker's estate is structured in an unusual way. He was deliberate about this and had it reviewed by 3 separate legal teams over the past year. The primary beneficiary of the trust is, he paused just briefly, your dog, Ranger. Lucas didn't say anything. I understand that sounds, keep going. Since Ranger is an animal and therefore cannot legally hold property, the trust designates a human trustee to manage all assets on the beneficiary's behalf. That trustee is you. You would have full fiduciary authority over all estate assets, subject to the trust terms, which are generous in their scope. Wren looked at him directly. In practical terms, Mr. Mercer, this means you control everything. Lucas sat back in his chair. The weight of it was physical. Not the money exactly, but the reason for it. The image of an old man pressed against a car door with his hands up, and the fact that Lucas had not done a calculation in that moment, had not thought about outcomes or rewards or what he was getting himself into, had simply seen something wrong and corrected it and driven away. His family, Lucas said. They know? The will was read to them formally 2 days ago. Wren's expression didn't change, but something in his posture said more. It was a difficult session, I'd imagine. Marcus Whitaker has already retained separate legal counsel. There will likely be challenges. There always are. Lucas folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. What happens to Ranger if something happens to me? Wren looked briefly surprised by the question. The trust has a contingency structure, but Mr. Whitaker anticipated the question. He included a provision. In the event of your incapacitation or death, A board of trustees takes over management with a specific mandate to continue funding veteran and service animal programs in perpetuity. He thought of everything. He was a thorough man. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Through the glass wall of the conference room, he could see the rest of the office. Lawyers at desks, assistants moving between rooms, the ordinary business of people whose ordinary business happened to involve large amounts of other people's money. "What do I need to sign?" he asked. Blunt. He sat in the truck for 20 minutes before starting it. Ranger had his chin on the center console and was watching Lucas with that particular attention. The kind that said he knew something had happened and was waiting for Lucas to process it at his own pace, which was the right instinct, because processing it was not a fast operation. $320 million. It was a number that didn't fit in any frame Lucas had for understanding his own life. He made $1,800 a month from disability. He owned a coffee maker that had cost him $11 at a thrift store. He'd been rationing dental visits. The number didn't mean anything to him in the abstract. It was too large to be real, the way distances and space were too large to feel true. What felt real was the letter. The 3 pages in the sealed envelope that he had carefully folded and put in his jacket pocket, and which he would keep, he already knew, for the rest of his life. He called Ray. Ray answered on the second ring because Ray always answered on the second ring, and when Lucas told him, flat, simple, the way he'd have delivered a field report, the silence on the other end lasted long enough that Lucas checked to see if the call had dropped. "Ray? I'm here." Ray's voice was strange. "Say the number again." 320. Million. Million. Because of a dog. Because of me and a dog, technically. But yes. Another silence, then Ray said very quietly, "Brother, what the—" "I know." "What are you going to do?" Lucas looked out the windshield at the Ravenshore skyline, at the glass building he'd just come out of. At the ordinary Thursday afternoon moving past on the street, people walking to lunch, a delivery truck double parked, a kid on a skateboard going too fast for the sidewalk. "Same thing I was going to do before," he said. "Figure out the next objective." That's the most Lucas Mercer answer in history. Probably. He started the truck. "I'll call you tonight." He drove back to Harbor Point. Wasima. The news broke 48 hours later. He hadn't told anyone outside of Ray and Theodore Wren, but the Whitaker estate was a matter of public record, and someone at the Ravenshore City Courier had a source in the probate court, and by Saturday morning the story was on 3 local news sites and climbing. By Saturday afternoon it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By Sunday, it had a life of its own. Veteran and his service dog inherit $320 million estate. Military dog becomes one of America's wealthiest animals. Who is Lucas Mercer? The soldier behind the viral inheritance. He was still in the studio apartment in Seaview District when it happened, because Theodore Wren had advised him to make no significant moves until the legal situation with Marcus Whitaker had been assessed, and Lucas was inclined to agree. The apartment was still small. The coffee maker was still the $11 thrift store one. Ranger was still eating the good food, and Lucas was still eating whatever was on sale. But his phone had stopped being a quiet object. He let most of the calls go to voicemail. He answered Ray's, he answered his mother's, which was an experience. She cried for about 4 minutes and then got herself together and started asking practical questions, which was exactly who she was and why he loved her. He answered a text from Clara Rodden that said simply, "I saw the news. You okay?" And replied, "Yeah. PT Thursday still on." She sent back a thumbs up. He did not answer the number he didn't recognize that called 11 times on Saturday and 12 times on Sunday. He recognized the prefix, Harbor Point Exchange, specific to a neighborhood about 8 blocks east of his old apartment. Vanessa had kept her number when she moved. He blocked it on Sunday evening without listening to a single message, the way you cleared a room, efficiently, without sentiment, leaving nothing behind to work with. What he did do, on Saturday evening, was sit at the kitchen table with Ranger across from him and the thin folder of his current finances and start making a list. Not of things he wanted to buy or places he wanted to go. A list of what needed to happen, in order, one objective at a time. Meet with Wren again Monday, Get a financial advisor who wasn't going to try to impress him. Look at the trust terms properly. Understand the company holdings. Understand the real estate. Understand what Marcus Whitaker was likely to do and prepare for it. The operational mindset. It was all he knew, and right now it was exactly what this situation required. He wrote for a long time. Ranger slept. The neighbor through the wall had a quiet night for once. At some point, Lucas realized he hadn't eaten dinner and made a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter and looked at the list and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a man who was oriented. Not arrived, not finished, but oriented, facing the right direction, with terrain he could read and objectives he could name. It was enough. The thing about Marcus Whitaker, which Lucas learned over the following 2 weeks through Wren and through the careful background work he'd started doing on his own, was that Marcus was not stupid. Bitter, certainly. Aggrieved, absolutely. But not stupid, and that made him more dangerous than the average disgruntled heir. He was 44, Edmund's nephew through a younger sister who had died when Marcus was 12. Edmund had raised him partly. School fees, connections, the initial capital for Marcus's first real estate venture, which had done well enough. Marcus had spent 20 years in and around Edmund's orbit, close enough to the wealth to feel like a participant in it, distant enough from the actual decision-making to have developed a profound sense of injustice about that distance. He had expected the inheritance. Not just expected, he had planned around it, built around it. There were loans, Wren mentioned carefully, that had been taken against anticipated assets. There were lifestyle commitments. There was a level of financial exposure that made the contents of Edmund's will not just a disappointment, but a crisis. "He's going to come at this hard," Lucas said at their second Monday meeting. They were back in the same conference room, Ranger lying under the table with his chin on his paws. Wren had not commented on the dog's presence. "He's already engaged Harmon Leach," Wren said, which apparently meant something significant because he said it with a specific flatness. "They're a litigation firm. They do a lot of estate contests." "Are they good?" "They're aggressive." "That's not the same thing." "No," Wren agreed, "but combined with resources and motivation, it's often effective enough." Lucas looked at the documents spread across the table. The trust was solid. Wren and 2 of his partners had been emphatic about that. Edmund had not left anything to chance, but solid and unchallengeable were not the same thing, and a sufficiently aggressive legal challenge could tie up assets for years regardless of how it ultimately resolved. "What grounds?" Lucas asked. "Testamentary capacity is the most likely avenue, arguing that Mr. Whitaker was not of sound mind when he drafted the will, or that he was unduly influenced. By me, by you, or by whatever relationship they'll try to construct between you." Wren folded his hands on the table. "They'll also likely challenge the beneficiary structure. The idea of a dog inheriting is going to play well in the press." "Both ways," Wren said. "In your favor with the public, less so with certain judges." Lucas nodded. He'd been thinking about this, the way a chess player thought about it, which was less about the current move and more about the board 4 moves ahead. The challenge was real, but it had shape, and things with shape could be defended. "Keep building the documentation," Lucas said. "Everything about Edmund's state of mind in the period before he died. Medical records, communications, anyone who interacted with him. If he was clear, I want a record of it that's airtight." "We're already doing that." "Do more of it." Wren looked at him with an expression that was becoming familiar. The slight recalibration that happened when people expected the veteran in the Kane and studio apartment and encountered something else instead. "I should tell you," Wren said carefully, "that Marcus has been making contact with people in your life, asking questions, background-type questions." Lucas went very still. "What kind of questions?" "About your mental health history, your medical retirement circumstances, whether you'd ever exhibited—" Wren paused, choosing words. "Erratic behavior, instability." The room was quiet for a moment. Ranger lifted his head from the floor and looked at Lucas. "How far back is he going?" Lucas asked. "I don't know yet. We heard about this through a mutual contact, not through formal channels." Lucas sat with that for a moment. It was a specific kind of play, the kind that required getting out ahead of it before it had traction. He knew how this worked. He'd seen it used in other contexts, against other people, and the mechanics were always the same. You didn't need to prove anything. You just needed to create enough noise that the story became troubled veteran instead of selfless act. Once that frame was established, everything else looked different through it. "Who's he talked to so far?" Lucas asked. "We're trying to determine that. Try faster." He stood up, gathered the documents he needed, and looked at Ranger, who was already on his feet. The drive back to Seaview District was quiet. He took the long way, the way that went past the waterfront, because he needed the extra 12 minutes to think, and the water had always helped him think. Some habit from childhood that had never left. He parked and sat. Marcus was going to build a picture of him, a specific targeted picture, unstable, isolated, manipulated. A broken soldier who'd been used as a vehicle for a confused old man's eccentric impulses. The picture wasn't going to be true, but truth was only one factor in how effective a narrative became, and often not the most important one. What Lucas had on his side, the truth, a solid trust document, a deceased man who had clearly been methodical about his intentions, and the particular advantage of having spent a career in environments where knowing what was coming was the only reason you survived what came. What Marcus had: money, lawyers, motivation, and no moral constraints about what tools he was willing to use. Lucas pulled out his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 8 months. It rang 4 times, and then a woman's voice answered, brisk and sharp. "Mercer, it's been a while." "Diane." He watched the water. "I need a favor, the kind you're good at." A pause. "How big a favor?" "Background work, deep. Someone's building a file on me, and I need to know exactly what they have before they use it." "Who's the someone?" "Marcus Whitaker. He's in Ravenshaw." "I know who Marcus Whitaker is." Her tone had shifted. Not warmer, but more interested. "That's the estate thing. The dog." "The dog? You're serious." "I'm always serious, Diane." Another pause. When she came back, her voice had settled into a particular register, focused, professional, the tone of someone who had just decided to be interested in a problem. "Send me what you have. I'll start tonight." He thanked her and ended the call. Ranger put his head over the center console. "We've got work to do," Lucas said. The dog's tail moved once, slow and certain. Above the water, the sky was doing something complicated with the evening light. Orange bleeding into gray, the horizon trying to decide what it was. Lucas watched it for another minute, then put the truck in gear and drove back toward Seaview, already building the list in his head. Diane Castillo had once spent 14 months embedded with a counterintelligence unit in a country whose name she wasn't legally permitted to say in mixed company, and she had a particular gift for finding the architecture underneath a person's public face. The load-bearing walls, the hairline fractures, the places where the structure didn't quite match the blueprint. She called Lucas back in 4 days. "Your guy Marcus has been busy," she said, without preamble. "He's talked to 6 people so far. 2 former colleagues from Bridgepoint. Neither of them gave him anything useful, for what it's worth. 1 neighbor from your old building in Harbor Point. 1 physical therapist." Lucas went cold. "Clara Rodden." She told him to go to hell, apparently, very professionally, but he asked, "Who else?" A pause that had weight in it. "He found someone who served with you. 3rd deployment, FOB Kestrel. A guy named Dennis Pruitt." Lucas was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough that Diane said his name. "I'm here," he said. "Pruitt. What did he give them?" "Nothing yet. But he took the meeting, Lucas. He took the money for the meeting." He put the phone down on the counter and stood there with both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Ranger was watching him from across the kitchen with the particular stillness that meant the dog had registered something in Lucas's body before Lucas had fully registered it himself. Dennis Pruitt had been on the team at Kestrel, a good operator, skilled, disciplined, the kind of man you wanted on a breach. He'd also had a difficult return. Substance issues, a divorce, work that came and went. Lucas had reached out twice in the last 2 years and gotten short replies that suggested a man who was embarrassed by his own situation and didn't want witnesses to it. Desperate people were useful to people like Marcus Whitaker. Okay, Lucas said. He picked the phone back up. What's Pruitt's current situation? 3 months behind on rent, child support in arrears, he's been doing day labor. Send me his address. Lucas, I'm not going to do anything to him, Diane. I'm going to talk to him. Another pause. The address is in Kellside, not a great neighborhood. I know Kellside. He was already reaching for his jacket. What else? Marcus has also been in contact with a veterinarian named Gerald Foss. Guy lost his license 2 years ago for falsifying records in an insurance case. He's the kind of doctor who does what you pay him to do. What's Marcus paying him for? We don't know yet, but a disgraced vet who fabricates records connected to the nephew of the man who just left his estate to a dog. She left the rest of it open. He's going to use Ranger, Lucas said. It came out flat, certain. He's going to try to have Ranger declared unfit or dangerous or claim that the dog's health was misrepresented, that you knew about conditions that made Ranger unsuitable as a beneficiary, grounds to void the trust structure. Can he do that? With a cooperative expert witness and a sympathetic filing, he can make it expensive enough that it starts looking like the easier path is settlement. Lucas zipped his jacket. Send me everything you have on Fossey, the license revocation documents, whatever led to it, who he's worked with since. Already packaged. Check your email. He was at the door. Ranger stood up. Diane, how fast can Marcus move on this? Harmon Leach filed 2 preliminary motions yesterday. One's a request to appoint an independent trustee pending contest. The other's a petition to have Ranger examined by a court-approved veterinarian. A beat. Not Fossey. That's too obvious. But Fossey will be feeding questions to whoever they do appoint. Lucas opened the door. I'll call you tonight, he said. Kellside was 40 minutes east of Seaview, past the industrial corridor and into a neighborhood that the city had been meaning to redevelop for approximately 15 years. The streets were wide in the way that meant they'd once been industrial thoroughfares and had never quite recovered their identity afterward. Half the storefronts were shuttered. The other half were trying. Dennis Pruitt's building was a 2-story converted warehouse with 8 units and a parking lot that had grass growing through the cracks. Lucas sat in the truck for a moment when he arrived, looking at the building and doing what he'd always done before a difficult conversation, getting clear about what he wanted to come out of it and what he was willing to give to get there. He wasn't angry at Pruitt. That was the first thing to be clear about. Anger was a resource, and this wasn't the place to spend it. He knocked on the door of Unit 4. It took a while. Then the door opened as far as the chain allowed, and Dennis Pruitt looked out at him through the gap. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. Pruitt looked older than he should have at 38, thinner, the kind of thin that wasn't a choice. Mercer, Pruitt said. Hey, Dennis. The chain came off. The door opened. The apartment was small and almost empty in the way that happened when things had been sold off gradually. A mattress on the floor in the back, a folding table. A television that was too big for the space, probably the last thing a man kept. There was a sleeping bag on the couch that might have been for a child on weekends, or might have been because the bedroom was cold. Pruitt stood in the middle of it without apologizing for it, which Lucas respected. You know why I'm here, Lucas said. Yeah. Did you sign anything? Pruitt looked at the floor. Not yet. Good. Lucas sat on the edge of the folding table because there was nowhere else to sit. Tell me what he offered. 12,000. Pruitt's voice was flat. For a written statement about your mental state after Kestrel, about the... He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. About the building collapse. How you were afterward. How was I afterward? You were... Pruitt stopped again. This time the silence lasted longer. You were messed up, man. We all were. But you got quiet in a specific way. You stopped talking. For like 3 weeks you barely said 10 words to anyone. That's accurate, Lucas said. I told them that, before I knew what they were going to do with it. And what are they going to do with it? Pruitt looked at him now, directly, with the particular discomfort of a man who knows he's done something and can't fully justify it, but also can't fully blame himself. They're going to say you had a psychological break after the incident, that you've never been right since, that your judgment can't be trusted. Lucas nodded slowly. The room was quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck was reversing with the beeping sound that drilled into your skull. "Dennis," Lucas said, "what do you actually need?" Pruitt blinked. "What?" "You took the meeting because you're in trouble. I'm not here to lecture you about it. What do you actually need right now, practically?" Pruitt stared at him. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but the sudden visible weight of someone who had been braced for a different conversation. "I'm behind on—" "I know, Diane told me." "You had someone run me?" "I had someone run Marcus. You came up in it." Lucas looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to pay you to say something. That's not what this is. But I can cover the arrears, child support, and rent, get you current. And I can put you in contact with a security firm in Ravenshore that does contract work. Good work, the kind you're qualified for. That's not contingent on anything you say or don't say. It's because you're a guy who served and you're having a hard time, and I have resources now." Pruitt sat down on the mattress in the other room through the open doorway. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. "Why?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a thing he was trying to understand. "Because I know what the bottom looks like," Lucas said. "And I know the difference between someone who's corrupt and someone who's just out of options." He stood up. "Don't sign anything for Marcus. That's all I'm asking. What you tell any court about what you actually observed, that's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what the truth is." He left a card on the folding table. Pruitt didn't say anything when he left, but he didn't have to. The legal proceedings accelerated in the third week. Marcus's team filed the independent trustee petition formally, which triggered a response requirement from Rennan and Ashby that ate 4 days and a significant amount of billable hours. The court-approved veterinary examination of Ranger was scheduled, a Dr. Patricia Helm, who came with credentials that were legitimate and a manner that was professionally neutral in the way Lucas had learned to read as carefully coached. He sat in the corner of the examination room at the veterinary clinic and watched her work and said nothing and let Ranger be exactly what Ranger was, which was a healthy 11-year-old dog with arthritic hips and the temperament of a career professional. Helm examined Ranger for 45 minutes. She checked his hips, his vision, his teeth, his weight, his responses to various stimuli. She asked Lucas questions about diet and exercise and veterinary history, and Lucas answered them accurately and completely, because accuracy and completeness were the only play here. When she was done, she made notes in a folder and looked at Ranger, who was sitting calmly and watching her with his ears forward. "He's in good health for his age," she said carefully. "His hips are consistent with what you'd expect in a retired working animal. His cognition is normal. His temperament is—" she paused. "Frankly, excellent." "He's always been solid," Lucas said. She looked at him. The petition suggested he might exhibit signs of aggression or anxiety. "Does he?" She looked at Ranger again. "No." Lucas said nothing. "Let it sit." "I'll file my report with the court," she said. He thanked her and left, and he did not allow himself to feel relieved until he was outside and 2 blocks down the street, at which point he sat on a bench in a small park and let out a breath he'd been holding for 45 minutes, and Ranger leaned against his leg with his full weight. "Good job in there," Lucas said. The dog looked up at him, and then away. At the park. At the pigeons, doing whatever pigeons did. Unbothered. Entirely himself. The day the trust was formally confirmed by the court was a Wednesday in late June, gray and humid, the kind of day that made the city feel like it was thinking about something. Wren called at 9:47 a.m. to deliver the news, and Lucas was in the middle of his physical therapy exercises on the apartment floor, which was where he was most mornings, and he stopped and sat up and listened. "The independent trustee petition was denied," Wren said, and his voice had the restrained quality of someone who had genuinely wanted to make this call. "Judge Ellery found insufficient grounds. Marcus's team has 30 days to file a formal contest of the will, but our assessment is that they don't have what they need for it to succeed. What about the capacity argument? We filed the documentation Diane Castillo's team assembled: Edmund's medical records, correspondence, 3 independent witness statements from people who interacted with him in the 6 months before he died. His physician submitted an affidavit. The record is very clean. A pause. It would be very difficult to argue he wasn't competent. Lucas sat on the floor of the Seaview studio apartment with his bad knee extended and his hand on Ranger's back and looked at the water stain above the kitchen that he still hadn't told the landlord about. "Okay," he said. "There's one more thing. The oceanfront estate in Carver Point. It's ready for transfer. The property management company needs a decision about whether you want to move forward with taking possession." He'd seen photographs of the Carver Point property. It was on the coast north of Ravenshore, a compound rather than a house. Main residence, guest cottage. A stretch of private beach, 2 acres of landscaped grounds. In the photographs, it looked like the kind of place that belonged to a different category of person than Lucas Mercer of Seaview District. "Set it up," he said. "We'll take possession." He ended the call, looked at the apartment, the $11 coffee maker, the physical therapy printout still on the refrigerator from when Vanessa had been the one to put them there, and he'd never taken them down, not because he'd forgotten, but because they were still accurate and he wasn't sentimental about paper. He started making a list. The move to Carver Point took a weekend. Lucas didn't have much. That was both the sad and the practical truth of it. A man who had lived at the edge of his means for 2 years accumulated things only when they were necessary, and necessity was a narrow filter. He loaded Ray's truck twice, and that was it. 2 trips for a life, which sounded like a diminishment until you thought about what could be rebuilt from a stable foundation. The house was more confronting in person than in photographs. Not because it was ostentatious. Edmund Whitaker had apparently shared Lucas's allergy to unnecessary display, and the property was beautiful in a reserved, architectural way rather than a flashy one. Stone and glass, clean lines, a terrace that faced the water, old furniture that had been chosen for use rather than appearance, a kitchen that had clearly belonged to someone who cooked seriously. It was the scale of the quiet that was confronting. After the studio in Seaview, with its paper-thin walls and the neighbors' arguments, and the truck that always idled too long outside at 2 a.m., this quiet was almost physical. Standing in the main room with the terrace doors open and the sound of the ocean coming in, Lucas felt something he couldn't immediately name. Ranger went straight to the terrace, stood at the railing with his nose up, reading the air. His tail moved in slow sweeps. "Yeah," Lucas said. "It's something." That first night he slept better than he had in 2 years, which he hadn't expected, and he woke up at 5:30 out of habit and lay in the bedroom listening to the ocean and felt the specific strangeness of a man who has been in one story for a long time and has suddenly found himself in a different one. He did his exercises. He fed Ranger. He made coffee in the serious kitchen and stood at the terrace railing and drank it while the morning came in off the water. Then he got to work. The foundation idea had started as a line item in one of his late-night lists, a note that said simply, "Veterans plus service animals plus something permanent," and had grown from there with the quiet accumulation of a thing that was trying to exist. He talked to Wren about it, to a nonprofit consultant named Barbara Fielding, who Wren had recommended, to Ray, to Clara Rodden, who had not been surprised in the least. "Of course you're starting a foundation," Clara had said at his Thursday PT session, pressing around his knee in the way that hurt, but was worth it. "What else would you do?" "I could just—" he started. "What?" "Live on a beach. You'd be insane in a month." She moved to the lateral band work. "What's the focus?" "Veteran reintegration and retired military working dogs, adoption, care, placing them with vets who need them. The research says animal-assisted therapy has significant outcomes for PTSD and transition adjustment, but the funding infrastructure is patchy." He stopped. "That's what the consultant says anyway." "The consultant's right." Clara looked at him over the table. "How much time are you actually spending on the PT exercises?" "All of it." "Because this lateral range is better." "I told you." She made a note. The foundation is a good idea, Lucas. I know, he said. I just want to do it right. Barbara Fielding had been equally direct, which was why he'd kept working with her. She had a background in nonprofit law and had spent 12 years running a veterans services organization in the Pacific Northwest before moving to Ravenshore, and she was the kind of person who responded to a meeting request by sending a 3-page agenda before you'd even confirm the time. The name? She asked at their second meeting, in the Carver Point kitchen over coffee that was dramatically better than anything Lucas had been making in Seaview. Ranger Foundation, he said. It was Wren's suggestion. I like it. Simple, draftable, doesn't require explaining. She made a note. The inaugural event. You want to do it in Ravenshore? Venue suggestions? The Harrow building has a ballroom that holds 400. It's the right kind of visible without being flashy. Exactly. He nodded. Book it. What's the earliest available? She checked her tablet. There's a Saturday opening in October, 8 weeks. Take it. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup with the appraising look he'd gotten used to from people who had expected one version of him and encountered another. You make decisions fast. I make decisions when I have enough information, he said. I had enough information 2 minutes ago. She smiled and made another note. Marcus Whitaker did not file the formal contest within the 30-day window. Wren delivered that news with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been right about something important. The reason, Diane established through channels she didn't fully explain, was that Dennis Pruitt had declined to provide the statement, had declined, in fact, to have any further contact with Marcus's legal team, and had retained a lawyer of his own, which Lucas suspected was not a coincidence given that the retainer had appeared 2 days after Lucas's visit to Kelside. Without Pruitt's testimony, the psychological angle doesn't hold, Diane said on the phone. And without that, the capacity argument is about a man who built an empire over 40 years and left it exactly as he intended, with full documentation. Marcus can't touch it. What's he doing now? Complaining loudly to anyone who will listen, mostly. He gave an interview to a financial publication last week, very careful, legally. He didn't make direct accusations, but the implication was clear enough. What implication? That Edmund was lonely and isolated in his final years and became attached to the wrong people. A pause. He specifically mentioned Ranger, called the inheritance structure a publicity stunt orchestrated by people who knew how to exploit a grieving old man's sentimentality. Lucas was on the terrace when she said this. The ocean was doing what the ocean did. Indifferent, enormous, keeping its own schedule. He watched a pelican work the surface about 30 yards out. He's not done, Lucas said. No, Diane agreed. He's just recalibrating. Keep watching him. Already am. The evening before the gala, Lucas stood on the terrace with a glass of water and went through the guest list in his mind the way he'd go through a pre-mission brief, methodically assigning significance to each element, noting gaps and vulnerabilities. 400 people. Veterans and their families, service dog organizations from 6 states, journalists from 3 outlets he had agreed to give access to for the evening, several of Edmund's former business associates who had reached out to express support, men and women who had known Edmund well enough to be angry on his behalf about Marcus's public comments, 2 federal judges, a state senator, a decorated Army general who had served 2 of his own deployments and who had RSVP'd to the event with a handwritten note that said simply, I'll be there. Well done. Ray was flying in from Denver. Clara Rodden had sent a donation and a note saying her whole clinic was coming. Barbara Fielding had been operating on 4 hours of sleep for 2 weeks and had the focused expression of someone running a military logistics operation, which Lucas respected deeply. He'd bought a suit. He hadn't owned one. The purchase had been practical and slightly strange, standing in a tailor's fitting room in Ravenshore, looking at himself in the mirror in a charcoal jacket, while Ranger sat behind him on a chair and watched with what Lucas could only interpret as mild amusement. Don't say anything, Lucas had told him. Ranger had thumped his tail. That night before sleep, Lucas sat at the desk in the study. Edmund's desk, solid walnut, the kind of piece that expected you to make real decisions at it, and looked at the list for the gala. at the program Barbara had finalized, at the trust documentation that outlined the foundation's initial mandate and funding structure. He thought about Edmund Whitaker pressing a business card into the hand of a stranger on the shoulder of Highway 9 and the stranger driving away. He thought about the letter with the leftward slanting handwriting. He thought about a studio apartment and bad coffee and a dog eating better than his owner because that was the right order of things. He thought about Dennis Pruitt on a mattress in Kelside, elbows on his knees, trying to understand why someone was helping him without extracting something for it. He closed the folder and went to bed and slept the solid, anchored sleep of a man who knows what the next day's objective is and has prepared for it correctly. He did not know, falling asleep, that Marcus Whitaker had spent the evening in a different kind of planning session, one that involved a man named Gerald Foss and a lawyer from Harmon Leach, and a stack of documents that had been fabricated with the particular care that desperate people applied to their worst ideas. He did not know that the ballroom at the Harrow Building the following night was going to be the site of something that had nothing to do with charity. Ranger, at the foot of the bed, lifted his head once in the dark, then lay it back down. The morning of the gala arrived the way important days sometimes did, unremarkably, with thin October light coming through the terrace doors and the ocean making its usual indifferent noise, and Ranger needing to go out at 5:45 regardless of what the day had scheduled. Lucas took him down to the beach path and walked the half-mile to the water, and stood there in the gray early light while Ranger worked the tide line, nose down, absorbed in information that only he could access. The cold came in off the water with serious intent. Lucas stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the horizon and ran through the evening sequence the way he'd run through operational timelines. Entry points, key moments, contingencies. What could go wrong, and what the response to it would be. He'd been doing this for 3 weeks. Every variable he could identify he'd prepared for. He had not prepared for everything. He knew that. You never did. The honest operators knew that the plan was scaffolding, useful right up until the moment contact was made with actual reality, at which point you adapted or you didn't, and the quality of your preparation determined how fast and how well you could adapt. He'd prepared well. Ranger came back from the tide line and sat beside him, and they both looked at the water for a while. "Tonight," Lucas said. Ranger looked up at him. "I know," Lucas said. "Me too." But the Harrow Building was a converted textile warehouse in the Meridian district of Ravenshore, exposed brick and steel beams, and the kind of lighting that required a professional to make look that effortless. The ballroom held 400 people comfortably and had a stage at the north end with sightlines from every point in the room. Barbara Fielding had been there since noon. By the time Lucas arrived at 5 o'clock, the space had already been transformed. Round tables with simple centerpieces, a stage setup that was clean and functional rather than theatrical, a display along the east wall of photographs and materials about veteran reintegration outcomes and military working dog adoption statistics. No galas, in Lucas's experience, looked like the people who were supposed to be at them. They looked like the best version of an aspiration, which was either honest or dishonest, depending on how you felt about aspirations in general. Barbara met him at the door with a tablet and an expression of focused calm. "Catering is set. AV ran a test 20 minutes ago. No issues. General Harwick's people confirmed he's en route." She looked at Ranger. "I have a water station set up for him near the stage." "Good. The 3 journalists have their access passes. I've told them no candid shots of Ranger without your okay, and they've agreed." She paused. "Marcus Whitaker was not on the guest list." "I know. He's also not banned from the venue, technically, since it's a public-facing charity event." "I know that too," Lucas said. She looked at him with the expression she'd started using around the 4th week of working together. The one that said she was trying to determine whether his calm was genuine or performed. She'd concluded, he thought, that it was mostly genuine. She hadn't decided yet whether that was reassuring. "Is there something specific you're watching for tonight?" she asked. "Just run the event, Barbara. I'll watch what needs watching." But chat. Ray arrived at 6 with his wife, Elaine, and a handshake that turned into the kind of hug that men who have been in bad places together permitted themselves once in a while. "You look different," Ray said, stepping back and looking at him. "I got a haircut." "No, I mean," Ray shook his head. You look like yourself again, like the old version. The old version had two working knees. You know what I mean? Lucas did know. He didn't say so because saying so required unpacking more than he wanted to unpack in the first 15 minutes of a gala. He shook Ray's hand again, and they left it there. Clara Rodden arrived with 4 colleagues from the PT clinic and made her way directly to Ranger, which was the correct priority. She shook Lucas's hand and said the room looked good, and he looked like he'd been sleeping properly finally, which was the most personal thing she'd ever said to him in 2 years of twice-weekly sessions, and he thanked her for coming. General Harwick came through the door at 6:50 with the quiet displacement of authority that senior military carried whether they were in uniform or not. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, with a handshake grip that was deliberately moderate. The kind of man who had learned that demonstrating force in a social setting was for people who were insecure about having it. "Mercer," he said. "General." They stood for a moment in the mutual recognition of men who inhabited different strata of the same world. Harwick looked at Ranger, who looked back at him with professional courtesy. 11 years old, Harwick said. 11 in December. My daughter had a shepherd that made it to 14. He looked at Lucas. You've built something here. I've read the foundation materials. The mandate is solid. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. I didn't do anything. He moved his eyes around the room. Edmund Whitaker was a decent man. I knew him slightly, years ago. He would have liked this. He moved on to greet other guests, and Lucas watched him go and felt the particular quality of those words, he would have liked this, settle somewhere they needed to settle. By 7:30, the ballroom was at 350. The noise level had risen to the comfortable, sustained hum of people who had found someone to talk to, which was the benchmark Barbara used for a successful pre-program cocktail hour. The catering team was doing clean, efficient work. The AV display was cycling through its content. Several veterans in the room had stopped in front of the photographs and were reading the statistical outcomes panels with the careful attention of people who recognized the subject personally. Lucas moved through the room without a fixed route, talked to people when they approached, didn't chase conversation when they didn't, introduced Ranger selectively. He'd made a decision early on that Ranger was not a prop for the evening, not a mascot or a photo opportunity, and Barbara had enforced this with diplomatic efficiency all week. He was on the far side of the room near the east wall, talking to a woman named Sandra Okafor, who ran a service dog training program in Virginia, when he saw it. Not Marcus. Not yet. Something smaller. A tell, the kind that trained observation turned into signal rather than noise. One of the wait staff near the main entrance, a young man in the standard white jacket, had been standing in the same position for 9 minutes without serving anything. Lucas clocked it the way he clocked everything that didn't fit its context, filed it, and kept talking to Sandra Okafor about the per-dog training cost differential between programs. 2 minutes later, the young man made a call on his phone with his back turned to the room. Lucas excused himself politely and moved toward the stage. He found Barbara near the AV station and spoke quietly without stopping. Front entrance, white jacket, near the coat check. He's not staff. Barbara didn't look toward the entrance immediately. She processed it first. You sure? He hasn't served a single drink. He's been on his phone twice in the last 15 minutes. She pulled up the staff roster on her tablet. We have 30 catering staff cleared through the venue. Get the venue manager to run a count. She was already moving. Lucas went to Diane Castillo, who was in the room in her capacity as a security consultant rather than a guest, wearing a dark blazer and the expression of a woman thoroughly bored by social events, which was her natural operational state. Front entrance, he said. Saw him 12 minutes ago, she said without looking at him. He's not alone. There's a woman at the bar on the south side who's been nursing the same drink for 40 minutes and hasn't talked to anyone. Marcus. Not personally here yet, but his people are establishing position. She turned her glass slightly. The Harmon Leach lawyer, Donovan, came in with the 7 o'clock wave. He's at table 11. Lucas absorbed this. Donovan is here personally, which means whatever's happening isn't just about tonight's optics. They're serving something. Papers, probably, or... She stopped, made a small adjustment to her posture that meant she'd seen something. Southeast entrance, just walked in. Marcus Whitaker had arrived. He came in through the secondary entrance that opened from the corridor rather than the main street entrance, which was either coincidence or intelligence, and Lucas suspected it wasn't coincidence. He was dressed for the room in a dark suit that fit well. He had the controlled affect of a man who had prepared himself extensively for a public performance and was now executing it. The surface pleasantness, the measured eye contact, the careful way he didn't look immediately at Lucas. Beside him was Gerald Fossey, the disgraced veterinarian. In person, he was smaller than Lucas had expected from his photographs, compact, with the slightly compressed energy of a man who had made bad choices and was in the process of making more. And one step behind them both was a woman Lucas hadn't seen before, mid-50s, dark-jacketed, with the very specific, purposeful carriage of a process server or a court officer. "There it is," Diane said quietly. Lucas stood still for 3 seconds and ran it. They were going to make their move publicly. That was the play. Maximum visibility, maximum disruption, the kind of scene that generated the photographs and headlines that reframed the entire narrative before the other side could respond. The charity gala becomes the fraud hearing. The Veteran Foundation becomes the contested estate. Whatever papers the woman was carrying, they were designed to be served in front of 400 people and 3 journalists. And whatever Fossey was here to say, it was designed to be said with cameras present. 3 seconds. Then Lucas turned to Diane and said, "Main stage in 10 minutes. Tell Barbara." Diane's eyes moved. "The program doesn't start until 8. It starts now." He found Ray in the crowd, touched his arm once. Ray looked at him and read the situation in his face the way men who had worked together read each other. Fast, without words. "What do you need?" Ray said. "General Harwick. Tell him what's about to happen and ask if he's willing to be on stage in 10 minutes. Don't pressure him." Ray was already moving. Lucas crossed the room toward the stage, and he did it the way he'd always crossed contested ground. Directly, without hurrying, without showing the calculation underneath. Ranger fell into position beside him, as if he'd been briefed on the timeline. Maybe he had been, in whatever way the dog processed the room's shifted energy. His ears were forward. He was watching. Barbara met Lucas at the stage steps with the tablet pressed against her chest and the expression of a woman who had just finished running a count. 22 catering staff verified, 8 unaccounted. "Their cover," Lucas said. "Witnesses or cameras or both." He looked at the stage. "We ready to go early?" "The program's a half hour." "Not the full program, just the opening. I need the mic in 5 minutes." She looked at him for a long moment. Barbara Fielding had spent 12 years running a veteran services organization, and she had a specific tolerance for controlled chaos that came from that experience. She was assessing him now, not doubting, just calibrating. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to change the sequence," he said. "That's all?" She nodded. Turned to the AV technician. "Mics live in 4 months." The house light shifted when the stage came up, a subtle change that moved the room's attention forward. The sustained hum of conversation descended in the gradual way it did when people registered a transition without being told about it. 400 people turning, glasses in hand, toward the stage. Lucas walked up without introduction. He had the cane, and he didn't try to compensate for it or minimize it. He walked up the way he walked everywhere, which was forward. Ranger came up beside him and sat at the left edge of the stage with the precise positioning of a dog who had worked crowd environments before and knew exactly where the sight lines were. The room quieted fully. In his peripheral vision, Lucas could see Marcus and Fossey near the back. He could see Donovan at table 11 with his briefcase slightly displaced from his chair, ready. He could see the woman in the dark jacket and what she was carrying. He could see Diane along the south wall, still and watchful. He could see Ray, back in position from his conversation with General Harwick, with the general beside him. He took the microphone. "I wasn't planning on starting this early," he said. "So, if your drink isn't at the right level yet, I apologize." A light laugh moved through the room, nervous energy finding an outlet. He let it settle. "My name is Lucas Mercer. Most of you know that, or you know the version of it that's been in the news for the last several months. The dog, the money, The whole story. He looked down at Ranger, who looked back at him. I want to tell you why we're actually here tonight, and I want to do it before someone else tries to tell a different version of it. The room changed, not dramatically, just a small tightening, a shift in attention quality. 400 people recognizing that the register had changed. In the back, Marcus Whitaker went still. 4 years ago, I drove past a man on the side of a road, Lucas said. He was in trouble. I stopped. It took maybe 12 minutes. I drove away. I did not think about it again, genuinely, until a lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning and said a man I couldn't place had died and left instructions about me. He paused. The man's name was Edmund Whitaker. He was thorough, he was decent, and he paid attention to the things most people don't bother paying attention to. He let the name land, felt the room register it, felt the specific stillness from the direction of the southeast entrance. Edmund decided to do something about that, something significant. And over the last several months, a number of people have tried to argue that what he did should be undone, that a man who built 40 years of careful decisions somehow lost his mind at the end of them, that I was the wrong recipient, for reasons that change depending on who's making the argument that week. He looked out at the room, at the journalists, at the veterans, at the service dog handlers in the third row who had driven from 3 states for this evening. I'm not going to spend this night responding to any of that, he said. Not because I can't. I can. And every legal process has concluded the same thing, which is that Edmund was clear, and his intentions were clear, and what he built is what he intended to build. He reached down and touched Ranger's head briefly. I'm going to spend tonight talking about what we're building with it, which is this, which is a room full of people who care about veterans coming home and finding something worth coming home to. From the back of the room, a sound, the beginning of applause, scattered, then more. Marcus moved. It was a deliberate move, the body language of a man executing a plan, stepping forward through the crowd with Donovan close behind and Fossey one step back. The woman in the dark jacket was angling from the side. Lucas saw it and did not stop speaking. Before we get into the program, I want to bring someone up. General David Harwick has served this country in 3 decades of military service, and he's been kind enough to say a few words tonight about what veteran transition support actually looks like from the ground level. Harwick was already moving toward the stage, and the applause grew, because a general walking toward a stage in a room full of veterans had its own gravity, and Marcus Whitaker could not compete with it. Harwick mounted the stairs. He didn't need a hand and didn't look for one, and took the place beside Lucas with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with attention. Marcus had reached the edge of the crowd. He was 12 feet from the stage. Donovan was beside him with the briefcase open. Harwick leaned toward the microphone and said, "Thank you, Lucas. I'll be brief." He was not brief. He was 8 minutes, and he was precise and forceful and personal in the way that men of genuine authority sometimes permitted themselves to be when the occasion demanded it. He talked about his own father's return from Vietnam and what absence of support looked like. He talked about what Lucas Mercer's record represented, not the inheritance, not the dog, but the 12 deployments and the conduct under fire and the medical retirement and the man who had gotten back up and kept operating. He talked about what the Ranger Foundation's mandate actually was, in specific terms, with numbers and outcomes and a clarity that left no interpretive room. The room was very quiet by the 3rd minute. By the 6th, Lucas could see that Marcus had not moved, was standing at the edge of the crowd with the papers in his hand and no viable moment to use them, because the entire room's attention and emotional energy had been committed elsewhere, and the window for disruption had been precisely closed. Donovan leaned toward Marcus and said something. Marcus shook his head, said something back. Donovan's posture shifted, the small, visible adjustment of a lawyer recalculating risk exposure. When Harwick finished, the applause was the kind that came from people who had actually been moved rather than people who were responding to a social cue. It lasted longer than most applause at events like this. The journalists were writing. The AV team had captured every frame. Lucas took the microphone back, looked at the room, looked briefly and directly at the back corner where Marcus was standing. "We're going to take a short break before the program continues," he said. "Thank you." But he came down off the stage and Diane was at the foot of the steps. Donovan's leaving, she said quietly. And Marcus? Still there. She paused. He's not happy. No. Lucas straightened his jacket. He's not going to be. The break lasted 15 minutes. Lucas moved through the room with Ranger, talked to veterans, talked to the program table, answered a question from one of the journalists about the Foundation's first funding cycle. He kept his back to the room only briefly, and only when he had eyes from Diane covering the angle. On the 13-minute mark, Marcus found him. He came from the left, cutting through a gap in the crowd with the forward momentum of a man who had run out of patience for strategic positioning. His face was composed in the specific way that faces were when composure was being actively maintained against competing pressure. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Lucas turned. "Marcus." The two men looked at each other. Around them, the cocktail hour noise continued, but a small radius of awareness had opened up. The people immediately adjacent who had registered the encounter and were making quiet calculations about whether to stay or move. Ranger sat down beside Lucas and faced Marcus, calm, attentive. "That was well managed," Marcus said. "The General, nice touch. I invited him 3 weeks ago." "Yes, I'm sure you did." Marcus's jaw was doing something, a small tightening at the hinge. "You know this isn't over." "You had 30 days to file a formal contest," Lucas said. "You didn't file. There are other avenues." "There are always other avenues." Lucas kept his voice level. Not cold, not warm. The temperature of a man who has no particular investment in how this conversation goes. "You can pursue them. That's your right. Your uncle's estate will continue to be managed according to his instructions while you do." "My uncle was a lonely old man who built $300 million over 40 years and was clear-headed enough to document every decision he ever made, including the last one." Lucas said it without heat. "I read his files, Marcus. All of them. He knew exactly what he was doing." Something moved through Marcus's face. Not quite anger, something more complicated. The anger was there, but underneath it was something that Lucas had seen before in people who were fighting something they already knew was true. The particular exhaustion of it. "He left me nothing," Marcus said, quieter than everything else he'd said. Almost something else underneath it. Lucas looked at him for a moment. "He left you 20 years of school fees and startup capital, and a seat at every table that mattered to him," Lucas said. "The will was about what came after." Silence. Fossey appeared at Marcus's shoulder, which was bad timing because whatever fragile human moment had briefly surfaced disappeared the instant the third party arrived. Marcus's face closed back into its operating position. "We'll be in touch through counsel," Marcus said. "My attorney's information is on the Foundation website," Lucas said. Marcus turned and left. Fossey followed. The small radius of awareness around Lucas dissolved back into the general noise of the room. Ranger looked up. "I know," Lucas said quietly. "It's not done." Fessin. The program ran clean. Barbara had structured it well. 3 veteran speakers, short and specific. No meandering. A video package about military working dog adoption outcomes. Lucas's own remarks, which he'd written himself and kept to 6 minutes, covering the Foundation's first-year plan and the specific programs that were already in development. He was not a natural speaker, and he knew it. He talked the way he thought, directly, without performance, with the particular economy of someone who had spent years in environments where words had operational weight and waste was a liability. The room responded to it, which still surprised him slightly. He had expected polish to be required. It turned out that plainness in the right room was more effective than polish. The applause at the end was real, the kind that came from people who had made a decision about something, not just responded to a moment. Ray found him afterward, near the stage, while the room was still warm with it. "You did good," Ray said. "Barbara did good." "Both." Ray looked at him. "Marcus is gone?" "For tonight." Ray nodded slowly. He understood what "for tonight" meant. The journalists filed out at 10, satisfied with what they had, and aware that the story they were writing was better than the one Marcus had tried to hand them. Barbara conducted a final walkthrough of the room at 10:45 and declared it concluded with the brisk satisfaction of someone who had executed a difficult operation without significant casualties. Lucas sat at the edge of the stage when the room had mostly cleared, Ranger beside him, The way they'd sat on 1,000 other edges of 1,000 other things. Forward operating base perimeters, hospital hallways, apartment doorways, the terrace at Carver Point looking at the ocean. Clara Rodden stopped on her way out. "Good night," she said. "Yeah," Lucas said. It was. She left, and then it was mostly staff and the fading sounds of an event concluding, and Ranger put his chin on Lucas's knee and Lucas put his hand on the dog's head, and they sat in the quiet for a while. His phone buzzed. A text from Diane. Fosse was wired tonight, recording device under his jacket. Nothing usable. Couldn't get close enough. But now we know what he's been trying to build. Lucas looked at the message for a long time, then he typed back. Document it, all of it. Every contact, every attempt, every dollar that moved. Diane. Already on it. He put the phone in his pocket, looked at the empty ballroom, the tables still set, the photographs still on the east wall, the foundation materials neatly stacked at the sign-in table. 3 months ago, he'd been in a studio apartment eating rice and beans. The dog had always been the same dog. Lucas stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the exit with Ranger beside him, through the emptying room and out into the October night where the city was doing what cities did, moving and breathing and carrying on, indifferent and alive, full of people whose stories were still happening. The drive back to Carver Point took 40 minutes, and Lucas made it in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that came after something significant had concluded, and the mind needed room to let it settle without narration. The city thinned out as he drove north. Fewer lights, longer stretches between intersections, the salt smell coming in stronger through the cracked window as the coast got closer. Ranger was in the back seat, which was unusual. He'd climbed back there without prompting after they'd loaded up, and Lucas had looked in the rearview mirror at him once and then left it alone. The dog was tired. They both were. The house was dark when he pulled in, the way a house was dark when no one had left lights on for you, which was fine. He was used to coming back to dark. He unlocked the front door and let Ranger through first, and then stood in the entry for a moment, jacket still on, and let the quiet of the place come in around him. He thought about what Diane had said. Fosse was wired. He went to the study and sat at Edmund's desk and opened his laptop and began writing notes. Not formal documents, just the operational kind, the ones he made for himself to think with. What he knew. What he suspected. What Diane could document versus what she'd need more time for. The shape of what Marcus and Fosse had been building, and what it meant that they'd tried to record tonight's event. They were still looking for leverage. That was the core of it. The legal channels had narrowed, the formal contest window had closed, but Marcus was not a man who accepted the narrowing of options as a final answer. He was going to keep looking for an angle, and as long as he was looking, the angle could eventually be found if Lucas wasn't paying attention. Lucas was paying attention. He worked until 1 in the morning. Ranger slept on the study floor with the specific weight of an old dog who had been on his feet too long, his breathing slow and slightly labored in the way it got when his hips were bothering him. Lucas had learned to read that breathing. He'd started adjusting the evening walks. Shorter distance, softer ground, less of the hard beach path and more of the grass above the bluff. You adapted to what was needed. That was all there was to it. He closed the laptop and looked at the wall where he'd pinned a map of the properties that were part of the trust, and the organizational chart of Edmund's company holdings, and the foundation's first-year timeline. It looked like an operational planning board, which was intentional, because that was the framework he thought in, and there was no point pretending otherwise. One thing at a time. He turned off the light. Bumped. Diane called at 7:40 the next morning while Lucas was on the terrace with his coffee and Ranger was doing a slow patrol of the garden perimeter, nose down, taking inventory. Fosse filed a declaration with the court, she said, 3 days ago. We just got it through a contact at the clerk's office. Lucas set down the coffee. What does it say? It claims that during a visit to a veterinary facility, which we cannot verify ever occurred, he observed Ranger exhibiting signs of severe cognitive decline and aggressive behavior. Specific clinical language, it reads like something written by a lawyer and handed to him to sign. Because that's what it is. Yes. A pause. It also claims that you were present during the visit and that you... She stopped for a half second. That you coached the dog's behavior and obstructed the examination. The morning was quiet except for the ocean and Ranger's footsteps in the garden below. "There was no visit," Lucas said. "There are no records of any visit. We've checked every veterinary facility within 40 miles. Another pause. "But the declaration is filed. It exists in the public record. Wren is already preparing a response, but a response takes time and the declaration is sitting there in the interim. What does Harmon Leach plan to do with it?" "We think they're going to use it to request a new examination order, different veterinarian this time, with specific behavioral testing criteria that Fossey has helpfully outlined in the declaration." She said helpfully the way soldiers said words that meant the opposite. "If Ranger doesn't perform exactly as Fossey's criteria define normal, there's grounds for a challenge." "Define normal per Fossey's criteria." "That's the problem. The criteria are ambiguous enough to be almost anything." She paused. "Lucas, this is designed to be unpassable." He looked at Ranger, who had stopped at the far edge of the garden and was looking at something in the hedge. A bird, probably, or just a smell worth investigating. An old dog doing what he'd always done. Working the world with his nose, finding information, staying curious. "How long do we have before Harmon Leach files the new examination request?" Lucas asked. "Days? Maybe less." "Okay." He picked up his coffee again. Let the heat of it settle. "I need everything on Fossey's license revocation. The original case, the specific records he falsified, who filed the complaint, who the victim was, what the outcome was." "I have most of it already." "Send it to Wren, all of it. I want the response to the declaration to include a formal referral to the State Veterinary Board about Fossey's continued practice without a license and his submission of fabricated clinical findings in an active court matter." Diane was quiet for a moment. "That's a criminal referral." "It's an accurate description of what he did." He set the cup down. "And I want everything we have on Marcus's payments to Fossey, the financial transfers, whatever shows the funding relationship. We have transaction records from an LLC Marcus controls to an account linked to Fossey. It's not definitive. It's a thread. Wren will know what to do with the thread." She made a sound that was her version of acknowledgement. Not agreement exactly, more like the sound of someone who had just updated their assessment of where this was going. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The woman who was at the gala last night, the one with the papers. We ran her." A beat. "Her name is Helene Park. She's a licensed process server, but she's also filed complaints twice in the last 3 years about being hired to serve fraudulent documents. Documents that were later found to be fabricated. She withdrew from both situations before the legal proceedings concluded. She knows what she's carrying when it's not right," Lucas said. "She does. And she walked out of the Harrow building last night without serving anything." Another beat. "Which means she looked at the situation and decided not to." Lucas thought about this. A process server who had twice stopped when she recognized something wrong, at some professional and financial cost to herself, who had showed up at the gala with whatever Marcus's team had prepared and had then looked at the room, looked at what was happening, and walked away. "Can we talk to her?" he said. "I was going to ask you the same thing." Helene Park agreed to meet without much persuasion, which told Lucas something about her state of mind. They met in a diner in the Meridian district 2 days after the gala, mid-morning when the place was mostly empty. She was a compact woman in her late 40s with short, dark hair and the alert watchfulness of someone who spent her professional life in rooms where she wasn't sure of the reception. Ranger was outside, tied to a parking meter where Lucas could see him through the window. Helene had asked about the dog when they'd arranged the meeting. He told her Ranger would be there. She'd said that was fine. They sat across from each other with coffee and the diner's particular ambient noise. The occasional plate sound, the low radio, the cook doing something rhythmic in the back. "I want to understand what I'd be committing to," she said. She was direct in the way people were when they'd made a preliminary decision and were looking for the final information to confirm it. "If I talk to your attorney, you talk to Wren. You tell him what you know about what Marcus's team prepared and asked you to serve. You tell him what you observed and why you didn't serve it." Lucas held his coffee cup. "That's it. Nothing more than what you actually know. And they come after me." "They might try. You've withdrawn from 2 situations before. You know what that looks like." He looked at her steadily. "But those situations didn't have the documentation we have on this one. We've been building the file for months. Fosse's payments, the communication records, the declaration he filed that has no supporting veterinary visits anywhere in the record." He paused. "You're not the vulnerable one in this. They are." She looked at the table, at her coffee, back at him. "The documents they asked me to serve," she said carefully, "were a motion to void the trust structure on grounds of fraud, with supporting affidavits." She stopped. 2 of the affidavits had signatures on them that I have seen before. On legitimate documents. They weren't She stopped again. The signatures weren't right. The diner was very quiet around them for a moment. "Forged," Lucas said. "I'm not a handwriting expert. But you've seen enough documents to know." She looked at him, didn't confirm it with words, didn't need to. "I'll talk to your attorney," she said. Theodore Wren, in 17 years of estate law, had handled difficult probate contests and adversarial heirs and the full spectrum of human behavior that was unlocked by the presence of significant inherited wealth. He had, in his own estimation, seen most of what the field had to offer. He called Lucas 3 days after meeting with Helene Park, with an energy in his voice that Lucas had not heard before. Not excitement exactly, more the controlled forward lean of a man who had just seen the complete shape of something and understood what it meant. "The affidavits Park identified," he said. "We had them analyzed by a forensic document examiner. 2 of the 4 supporting signatures are composite forgeries. They were assembled from authentic signature samples obtained from public filings." "Edmund's signatures," Lucas said. 2 are Edmund's. 1 is yours, taken from the trust documentation. 1 is a fabricated signature for a witness who, when we contacted her, had no knowledge of any affidavit and has never met Marcus Whitaker." Lucas sat in the study at the walnut desk and was very still. "That's a criminal matter," he said. "Multiple criminal matters. Document fraud, filing fabricated evidence in an active court proceeding, potential conspiracy charges depending on how the financial relationship between Marcus and Fosse is characterized." Wren's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it. "I've drafted a referral to the State Attorney General's office. I wanted to discuss it with you before filing." "File it." A pause. "Lucas, once this goes to the AG, I know what it means. File it." Another pause, shorter. "All right." "And Wren." Lucas looked at the organizational chart on the wall, at the company holdings, at the branching structure of what Edmund had built. The debt Marcus is carrying, the loans he took against anticipated inheritance. Do we know who holds that paper? Wren was quiet for a moment. "A private lending firm in Ravenshaw, Corrivan Capital. Why?" "Because I want to know if it's available for purchase." The silence that followed had a specific quality. The silence of a lawyer processing a move and concluding, after several seconds, that it was legally clean. "I'll make inquiries," Wren said carefully. "Quietly," Lucas said. "Of course." The Attorney General's office moved faster than Lucas had expected, which Diane said was because they'd been watching Harmon Leach for other reasons, and this gave them a clean entry point they hadn't had before. The investigation opened formally within 10 days of the referral. Marcus found out through his own lawyers, which meant he found out after the investigation was already in motion, and there was nothing to get ahead of. Fosse was the first to crack, which was also what Diane had predicted. He'd made a career of calibrating risk, and the risk calculation had shifted entirely, and within 3 weeks of the investigation opening, he had retained his own separate counsel and was in conversations with the AG's office about cooperation. The payments from Marcus's LLC, which had seemed like they might be ambiguous, turned out to have documentation that Fosse himself had maintained. He was, apparently, the kind of man who kept records of his own misconduct as insurance, which said something about how he'd assessed the durability of his arrangement with Marcus. Lucas learned all of this through Wren and Diane in separate calls on a Thursday afternoon, sitting on the Carver Point Terrace in November light that was cold and clear and doing interesting things to the surface of the water. Fosse's cooperation agreement includes full disclosure of the declaration he filed, Wren said. He's confirming it was fabricated. that it was written by Donovan at Harmon Leach and provided to him to sign. Donovan. Harmon Leach has already issued a statement indicating that Donovan acted outside the scope of his employment, which is what firms say when they're trying to preserve the firm while sacrificing the individual. Does it hold? Probably not. The AG's office has subpoenaed their internal communications. Lucas looked at the water. A container ship was moving along the distant horizon, so far out it was barely visible, just a shape with running lights, making its way somewhere with its cargo. And Marcus, he said. Wren was quiet for a moment. He's retained new counsel, someone outside of Ravenshore. It suggests he's preparing for something more serious than a civil proceeding. It's going to get worse for him before it gets better. Yes, Wren said. I think that's accurate. They ended the call. Lucas stayed on the terrace. The light was moving across the water the way it did in late afternoon, the angle changing, the color shifting from the flat brightness of midday towards something warmer and more complicated. He thought about Edmund Whitaker's letter and the phrase, "I've always found that animals are better at this than people." He thought about what it had meant to a man who had built an empire and watched his own family circle it for 40 years with the patient interest of people waiting for something to die. He thought about a kid from somewhere ordinary who had joined the army because a recruiter had looked at his test scores and opened a door, and the decade that had followed, and the building collapse, and the Harbor Point apartment, and Vanessa's suitcase, and the sealed envelope with the leftward slanting handwriting, and the 11-year-old dog who had never once in their time together calculated what he was going to get before deciding what to give. Ranger came through the terrace door and sat beside his chair and looked at the water with him. "We're almost done," Lucas said. Tot. Coravan Capital agreed to sell the debt in the third week of November. It was not a complicated negotiation. They were a private lender who had made a loan against anticipated inheritance that had not materialized, and they were looking at a borrower whose financial and legal situation was deteriorating rapidly. The offer Lucas's financial team made was fair market value for distressed debt, which was considerably less than the face value of what Marcus owed, and Coravan took 48 hours to accept. Lucas did not tell Marcus. He waited. The call from Vanessa came on a Wednesday morning, and he almost didn't take it. He would have let it go to voicemail, except that he'd unblocked her number 2 weeks earlier, not because he expected to hear from her, but because blocking it had started to feel like a thing he was doing for himself that no longer served the purpose it had originally served. He was past it. Blocking and unblocking were both reactions, and he was done reacting to Vanessa Brooks. He took the call. Lucas. Her voice was careful, practiced in the way it was when she'd prepared for a conversation. I know you probably don't want to. It's fine. What do you need? A pause. She hadn't expected fine. She'd prepared for resistance. Preston's company, she said. The name of the millionaire boyfriend from the yacht photos. There were some financial irregularities. The SEC opened an investigation 3 months ago. Another pause. Some of the accounts, I had my name on some of the accounts. Not because I knew, I didn't know what he was. Vanessa. I need... Stop. He said it quietly, not unkindly, just as a full stop. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. I'm not a resource for this. Whatever happened with Preston and his accounts is your situation, and you need a lawyer, not me. I know that. I just thought, whatever you thought, it's not the right call. He looked out the study window at the garden. I hope you get it sorted, genuinely, but I can't be the person you call when things go wrong. Silence. Lucas. Her voice had dropped to something smaller, the practiced layer gone. I know I was... Yeah, he said. You were. He let that sit for a moment, not cruelly, just honestly, the way honest things sometimes needed to sit before you moved past them. Take care of yourself, he said. And he meant it, and then he ended the call. He sat at the desk for a minute afterward, noticed that there was nothing in his chest, no anger, no residual ache, no complicated feeling requiring management, just the quiet of a thing that had been resolved by time and distance and the simple accumulation of living forward instead of backward. He went back to the foundation materials he'd been reviewing before the call. The letter from Coravan Capital arrived at Marcus's address on a Friday. Lucas knew because Diane was watching for it, the way she watched for most things that mattered. She called him that afternoon. "He knows," she said simply. "How did he take it?" His lawyer called Wren's office within 2 hours of the letter being received. 40 minutes of conversation that Wren described as, she paused, emotionally elevated. What did they want? To understand the implications. Wren explained them. She paused again. The debt is significant, and the investigation means his ability to service it through normal channels is compromised. Lucas already knew this. He had known it since he'd made the offer to Coravon. The math was not complicated. Marcus owed a number that, under the circumstances, he could not pay, and the entity holding that debt was now Lucas Mercer, acting through a trust vehicle, which meant that every option Marcus had to deal with it ran through the same place. It was not revenge. That was the thing Lucas had been careful about, with himself, in the weeks since Wren had raised the possibility. He'd sat with the question of whether this was something he was doing to Marcus or doing about a situation, and the distinction mattered to him because one of them was the kind of man he was and one of them wasn't. What he was doing was resolving a liability in the most structurally complete way available. What happened to Marcus as a result of Marcus's own choices was Marcus's consequence to carry. He called Wren. "Set up a meeting," he said. "Marcus, his new counsel, you, and me. In person." "Lucas, I'm not going to threaten him or offer him a deal, Wren. I'm going to talk to him like a person and let him decide what he does with the information." He paused. Edmund spent 20 years trying to have a real relationship with that man. The least I can do is have one honest conversation. A longer pause. "All right," Wren said. Okay. They met in the Wren and Ashby conference room on a Tuesday. Same room, same long table, same skyline through the glass. Marcus came with a lawyer Lucas hadn't met before, a quiet woman named Adrienne Cole, who had the manner of someone who had assessed the situation completely before entering the room and was now managing it rather than winning it. Marcus looked different than he had at the gala. Not broken. He was too controlled for that, but the performance layer was thinner. The suit was the same quality but worn differently, without the ease that came from feeling armored by circumstance. They sat across from each other with the lawyers on either side. Lucas looked at him directly. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said. "I want to say something to you and then we can discuss what you want to do." Marcus's jaw set. "Go ahead." "Edmund left you nothing in the will because he knew exactly what you'd do with it. That's in the documentation, not the public filing, the personal notes he made. He'd watched you for 20 years, and he loved you the way people love family, even when they can't trust them. And he made his decision, and he was right to make it." He paused. "That's not about you being a bad person. It's about who you chose to be when the pressure was on." Marcus was very still. "The investigation is going to go where it goes," Lucas continued. "I can't affect that, and I'm not trying to. Fossey and Donovan made their choices." He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "The debt with Coravon. I'm not going to call it. Not immediately. You have time to restructure if you make real decisions about what restructuring looks like." Cole leaned toward Marcus and said something quietly. Marcus waved her off. "Why?" Marcus said. Same word Pruitt had used. Same weight under it. "Because Edmund spent a lot of resources on you over 20 years, and I don't think the return he got was what he hoped for," Lucas said. "I'm not Edmund, but I've spent the last 8 months learning how he thought. And I think he would have wanted you to have a real choice. Not a manufactured one, a real one." The room was very quiet. Adrienne Cole was writing something in a notepad. Wren was looking at the table. Marcus was looking at Lucas with the expression of a man encountering something he didn't have a prepared response for, which was perhaps the most honest thing Lucas had ever seen on his face. "I don't trust this," Marcus said. "I know," Lucas said. "That's fine. The offer exists regardless." They wrapped up in 20 minutes. Nothing signed, nothing committed. Marcus and Cole left without looking back. Wren walked them out and then came back to the conference room and looked at Lucas with the measured expression of a man who had decided not to ask all the questions he had. "That was not what I expected," Wren said. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Something more punishing?" Wren considered this. "Perhaps." Lucas stood up, gathered his folder, looked at the skyline one more time. Edmund Whittaker stopped being punishing a long time before he died, he said. I think it took him a while to get there. I'd rather start there. He left Wren with that and went down to the lobby where Ranger was waiting with the building's front desk attendant, who had clearly spent the last 40 minutes making a friend, judging by the treats wrapper on the desk and the look on the dog's face. Sorry, Lucas said. The attendant shook his head. Best meeting I've had all week. Back. Christmas came to Carver Point quietly, the way holidays came to houses that didn't have children in them. The occasion was marked rather than performed. Ray and Elaine came up for 3 days, and they ate well and argued pleasantly about football and walked the beach path in the cold, and Ray spent an unreasonable amount of time throwing a stick into the surf for Ranger, who retrieved it with diminishing enthusiasm as his hips reminded him of their position on the matter. He's slowing down, Ray said, on the last evening, standing on the terrace with a beer, watching Ranger settle onto the outdoor mat with the careful management of old joints. Yeah, Lucas said. He okay? The vet says his hips are what they are. He's comfortable. He's eating. Lucas looked at Ranger, who had gotten himself arranged and was now looking at the water with his ears forward, still working, still paying attention. He's himself. That's what matters. Ray nodded. Good. They stood for a while without talking, the ocean doing its thing below, the cold coming in steady from the northwest. You seem different, Ray said finally. Same thing he'd said at the gala, but quieter this time. Not observational, something more like wonder. I told you, I got a haircut. Lucas, I know. He looked at the water. I'm okay, Ray. I think I'm actually okay. Ray clinked his bottle against Lucas's. About time. Chat. The Attorney General's office brought formal charges against Gerald Fossey and Andrew Donovan in late January. Fossey's cooperation agreement reduced his exposure but did not eliminate it. The declaration he had filed constituted fraud on the court, and there was no cooperative pathway that entirely erased that. Donovan faced 5 charges, 3 of which carried potential prison time, and Harmon Leach settled a separate civil liability matter before the calendar year was out. Marcus was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the filing, which was the precise legal position of a man who had funded a scheme without leaving enough direct evidence to charge as a principal. His lawyer negotiated his status carefully, and he was not charged. But the investigation report was public record, and his name was in it, and the financial press covered it the way they covered these things, without mercy and without forgetting. He did not call in the debt restructuring offer Lucas had made. He sold properties instead quietly over the following months, reduced his exposure the painful way. Lucas followed it through Diane's reports and said nothing publicly and made no moves with the debt. He waited to see what Marcus would choose to be when things were hard and no one was offering him an easy way out. But the Ranger Foundation's first annual report came out in March. Barbara Fielding had written the executive summary and Lucas had reviewed it and made 3 edits, all of them in the direction of less, not more. The numbers were real. 47 veterans placed in structured reintegration programs, 11 retired military working dogs adopted through partnership organizations, a research grant to a university studying animal-assisted PTSD intervention, a regional training center in early development. Not everything had worked. The pilot program in the Pacific Northwest had run into facility problems and been delayed by 4 months. A key hire had fallen through and they'd spent 6 weeks understaffed at a critical moment. The research grant process had taken twice as long as Barbara had projected and required 2 revisions. Lucas had noted all of it in the report. Barbara had wanted to soften some of it. He'd said no. If we pretend everything is clean, the people we're trying to serve will know we're performing, he told her. They've been around enough institutions that perform goodness without delivering it. We don't do that. She'd looked at him for a long moment. You know, most nonprofit boards don't want the problems in the annual report. We're not most nonprofits. She'd left the problems in. On a morning in April, Lucas sat on the Carver Point terrace in the early light with his coffee and his knee aching the way it always did when the pressure dropped before rain, and Ranger lying on the mat beside his chair with his gray muzzle on his front paws and his eyes open, watching the garden the way he always watched things. With the patient attention of a professional who never entirely stopped working, the foundation was running. The legal matters were resolved or resolving. The house was a house now, not a thing he was adjusting to. He thought about the apartment in Harbor Point with the water stain and the thin walls and the cheap coffee and the silence after the door had closed. He thought about the $11 coffee maker, about rice and beans at a kitchen table, across from a dog who had chosen to sit in the chair like he was invited because he was invited, and looking at a folder of bills and making the decision, deliberately, to look somewhere else. He thought about the letter in the desk drawer in the study. 3 pages of leftward slanting handwriting on heavy cream paper from a man he'd never known who had paid attention to something that lasted 12 minutes on the shoulder of a highway. The principle was simple enough. Character was not the thing you performed when conditions were favorable. It was the thing that showed up before fortune arrived, before recognition arrived, before anyone was watching or recording or standing by to reward it. It was what you did on a Tuesday when no one cared and you were tired and the situation in front of you was someone else's problem to solve. Lucas had learned this in the Army, in 12 deployments, in the specific economy of teams that operated in places where performance without substance got people killed. He had not known that it was the most valuable thing he'd carry out of it. He reached down and put his hand on Ranger's back. The dog's breathing was slow and even. His tail moved once. Outside the gate, down the road, the world continued its business. Complicated, imperfect, full of people making calculations about what they were willing to give and what they expected to get for it. Inside the gate, an old dog lay in the morning light, while the man who had never once left him worked out what the next thing was. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The truest things about a person are always visible long before anyone thinks to look, in how they treat those who can't reward them, in what they do when no one's watching, and who they choose to stay for.